Hello, I'm Heather Martin. I'm the subject leader for BA Fashion and MA tutor for Entrepreneurship and Creative Practices at Plymouth College of Art. I'd like to introduce you to Kate Fletcher. Kate is a fashion and sustainability pioneer, design activist, writer, nature enthusiast, and research professor at the Centre for Sustainable Fashion, the University of Arts London. She is the most cited scholar in fashion and sustainability, and her work, like that on post-growth fashion and fashion localism, both defines and challenges the field. She has written and edited 8 books translated into 7 languages. Her latest work is about design, nature, and clothing. Kate's work and writing is making futures possible. It recommends a strategic path to make sustainable design actually doable. I'm so very pleased to have you join us, Kate, and I'm looking forward to our discussion this morning. I've prepared a set of questions, and I do hope that the audience will have some questions as well. So the duration of the talk is 1 hour. Kate and I will talk for approximately 45 minutes, and then we'll have a 15-minute question period. So when preparing for this discussion, my thinking kept circling back to the writing of EF Schumacher's 1973 release, Small is Beautiful, a study of economics as if people mattered. This book uses ideas of Buddhist economics. Most of the writing puts the human at the center of the discussion, thinking through and suggesting appropriate technologies at a human scale. Kate's work and writing traverses beyond this idea of the human at the center and considers the larger picture, the environment and its ecosystems, putting the earth first, having loyalty to the planet before industry, business, and economic growth. So there'll be 2 overarching themes for our discussion today, fashion values and post-growth economics. So Kate, welcome.
Thank you. So nice to be here.
So I'm wondering, how has EF Schumacher influenced your thinking and your research? And if so, can you give an example? And then if not, can you share a list of top thinkers or ideas that have influenced your writing and your thinking?
I'm so happy that you raised EF Schumacher. So I first read EF Schumacher when I was in college. And his work, Small is Beautiful, specifically had a huge influence on me. But actually, it goes back further. So when I was in junior school, I mean, we're talking like early 1980s here, perhaps even before, maybe late 70s, something like that. I mean, a long time ago. I went and took part in an intermediate technology development group day, and I got a Small is Beautiful pencil. And it is one of my most treasured possessions. And that when I actually went on to read the book, I used to take notes with this pencil because it just felt like it was the coming together of things. So maybe that's marked my card in a way. And his ideas, which are quite wide-ranging in the book, but also they hold a real radical edge. I mean, he's approaching it perhaps in a slightly different way to me, but at the center of everything he's talking about is scale appropriateness. And that is a theme that absolutely is at the core of all of the things that I have done. And I think it's perhaps one of the key principles that maybe is overlooked within fashion and sustainability more broadly. You could look across the piece and think, okay, certainly in local communities, it's all about scale appropriateness. If we're thinking about volumes, which is one of the big issues that, we must talk about this quantity of how much we're producing, again, scale appropriateness feels really important. And then if you perhaps turn again and look at questions around nature, ecosystems, again, a species would grow up to the point at which it fulfills its niche, and then it stops growing. Then it moves into a different phase, into maintenance. And again, you begin to understand, actually, there's a scale appropriateness at work there. So, I mean, plainly, his ideas are through everything that I'm talking about and more. And of course, he had his Buddhist economics thing, which I think for many of the people that I now work alongside, that has become a practice Buddhism and spirituality in particular that help give us the edge to understand what we're dealing with here with these themes and questions.
And so do you feel like this sort of Buddhist practice brings you closer to nature and closer to thinking through nature for your, to come up with some solutions for design, better design, sustainable design?
Well, I have to say that I'm actually not a Buddhist, but I certainly am very sympathetic to Buddhism, and through like meditative practices, for instance. Many of those things, they begin to suggest a change in humility, I think, an ability to perhaps see things that maybe you hadn't noticed before because of an extended regard and attention and appreciation of this moment here and relationships and what that means. So I think that certainly what that does is that surfaces different sorts of questions for design. And if we're going to begin to deal with some of the biggest challenges that we face, which of course everybody knows, climate change is foremost amongst them, and biodiversity loss, for instance. If we're going to begin to do this, we perhaps need to approach what design is with a change, with less hubris. And maybe Buddhism is one of the ways that I think that we can begin to do that. And if we're not Buddhist practitioners ourselves, the things that Buddhists do as standard are the things I think that help us a bit like a skeleton key unlock what is going on around us.
Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about earth logic. The reason why I'm asking this, I'm interested for you to talk a little bit about some of our current strategies for sustainable change, and then some of the limits around that, and then what led you and Matilda Tam to develop this concept of earth logic.
So Earth Logic, which Matilda Tam and I co-authored in 2019, is a radical action plan for change, specifically in fashion, but actually it has sort of scope far beyond that. And the idea behind it was that we were extremely frustrated that change was so slow and piecemeal in the fashion context. And we looked around and there's lots and lots of activity, maybe you'd say like lots of busyness, but very little substantive change. And for anybody who is a scholar of systems thinking, this is a classic sort of systems problem, because people are working at a sort of low level in the system, affecting product level tweaks, when actually the issue that we need to do is we need to work much higher. We need to work at the level of the purpose of the system. We need to begin to ask about what is the goal of what we're doing here, and ask these much more strategic questions. So we need to refocus things elsewhere. And so as part of this systems scrutiny, Matilda and I are very aware that the thing that pretty much across the board limits the effectiveness of the change strategies that people are typically implementing is the economic growth logic. And this time and again prevents change from actually being meaningful. And it's largely because if you're improving a product within a system that's growing, the change that you will affect will not in any way outpace the growing size of the system. And so through Earth Logic, what we did is we proposed an alternative to growth logic, and we called it Earth Logic. And it's quite simply, it puts Earth first before the priorities of industry, before business agendas. And in doing so, it's an extremely sort of simple conceptual change, but it actually goes on to change everything. It's not in any way saying that industry isn't part of what we will go on to do. It's just that the purpose of the system is set in a different way. So when we begin to do that, we begin to see entirely different priorities. it's a bit like you can imagine a stream is flowing, and in that stream there's lots and lots of different activities with lots of small tributaries attaching to it, and all of this work is going on, but only some of that work will be based in industry, and fashion or other things becomes much more broadly rendered. So we begin to see it's expressed in community priorities. We begin to see it expressed in what goes on in households, in what goes on in the commons, in lots and lots of different places. So that was where we got to with Earth Logic. It was, that's where we still are, and it's become a very, very active project. It's had, we think, more than 1 million people around the world engaging with it, and it's now in Spanish and Brazilian Portuguese. And soon it will be in Swedish, the Scandinavian language, I think, which all other Scandinavians generally can read. So yeah, that's where we're at with it at the moment.
It's fantastic. Just looking through some of the writing and strategies used within Earth Logic, just break it down in a way that just seems very approachable. It's not this big epic thing anymore. If you just think about it in small steps, it seems very tangible and doable. So I really suggest, I put it in the chat box, the link. Feel free to go there and have a look, students, if you're interested.
Heather, may I just add just another thought to that? So the way that we imagined this this new starting point is we didn't just sort of conceptually like open it up and then leave it there. We did try to bring it to a tangible space, as you just said. And so we described what we call landscapes. So these are sort of territories that you can base work in. And so we named these 6 things, and we see them as sort of advanced starting points. You don't need to go through all of the questions around, do I need to choose materials or which supply chain? You can just sort of jump forward into a landscape of less or plural or local or governance or languaging or I can't remember the other one. I
think I have it here. Learning.
Yeah. You can move within that space and then work there. And that feels like the difference. There's loads of practical examples, and the work that Matilda and I are now doing with Earth Logic is all about moving an idea to action. Because one of the big things that we say in Earth Logic, there's no point in doing this work in a sort of an academic context if it just then sits on a library shelf gathering dust. I mean, quite frankly, what's the point? So it's absolutely about bringing it to action. And most of the people that we've spoken to about it feel such a sense of relief that growth logic is called out as the problem, because actually up to this point, people have been so frustrated because they don't know how to get past it. So we've shown one way where you can get past growth logic and begin to start again with many opportunities for fashion provision and expression in an Earth Logic world.
Yeah, so like you're saying there, it sort of goes to the high level rather than just sort of approaching it at a materials level or a organic versus not organic, which these are all great things, but they're not really making that big systems change that we really need to happen in sustainable design. So yeah, excellent work. I love it. So just to talk a little bit about values and mindsets and behaviors and attitudes, what kind of values, what kind of attributes do you think that students need to have to be able to start thinking through these like larger questions?
So that's such a good question. And I think there's probably 2 ways that maybe I could talk about that. So the first way is to think about what education is for, maybe. And maybe you would say that education is preparation for the future. But what we know is that our future at the moment is very unpredictable. What we see with climate change, what we see across the board, it's ambiguous. It's uncertain, and when we're stepping towards an uncertain, changing picture, we need different skills to the very sort of measurable ones about, quantifiable knowledge packets. Instead, we need different sorts of skills, I think, that are very aligned actually to design practice, to design education. And many of these things are around building a rigorous imagination, around building resilience, about helping people to deal with anticipated futures in a different way. And I think perhaps what we need to do is we need to sort of experiment in diverse ways of living. This is our task, and this is the way that we need to proceed through our education, and it's to open up that space to imagine what's possible. Up to this point, certainly in the UK, there's lots of educational establishments that are very aligned to business interests, and this, for better or, well, I would argue for worse, is really limiting the sorts of questions that people are asking. Or people are thinking, well, the only way I'm going to be able to get a job at the end of this is to just go into industry, so I might as well develop the skills that they're looking for now. But as we're going forward, I really see that industries are looking for different sorts of people with different sorts of skills, and perhaps these are some of them, these sort of things. And then the second way to perhaps think about that is that what we understand about fostering change is that the most powerful way to get people to alter their behavior without seeming that this is some sort of, influencing people without their wishing. But the best way to do that is to appeal to their values. So frequently people say, oh, if you appeal to people's wallets, if you say you're going to save money by recycling this over doing this, they think that that's the good way to influence behavior. But actually, it's been shown repeatedly that it's much more effective if you appeal to people's values, certainly in the longer term. And so that then rises to the surface a new important focus on values, and that we lead with values going forward. And again, in Earth Logic, that's what we did. We named a set of values that were leading us literally by the hand through the work, and then these values then become like work that help us make decisions about what's important. So this, I think, is the role of values in two, obviously two and many more different ways.
Great, thank you. So you're talking about diverse ways of knowing, diverse ways of thinking, diverse ways of thinking through design. I'm wondering how collaboration and cross-disciplinary practice has influenced you over the years, and how you might think this can support students' creative work and thinking.
Yeah. My preferred way of working is collaboratively. I'm not saying it's easy, because it never is, but this is the real work of collaboration. It's often part of what is like a feminist practice as well. It's staying with the trouble of all of the difficult things that rise up when you're collaborating. But time and again, and certainly I would say that Matilda and I have a very strong collaboration, and we're both really fortunate in that we really have each other's backs. We really trust each other. And what we've gone on to see is that what we create when we work together is so much better than our two sort of brains and bodies and hands separately. And this is like the power of it. And it's not like it comes without difficulty. So time and again, for instance, we've been asked to speak at various events, and they say, oh, just one of you just come, and we're like, hang on a minute, but that wouldn't really represent our collaboration. Our collaboration requires both of us. So we're both going to come, and they're like, oh, hang on a minute, but we've only got one microphone. And I'm like, okay, well, we'll share the microphone. So time and again, things are thrown. So what you see is that the world isn't set up to receive collaboration. It's set up to receive a sort of, to one person who is like the spokesperson for whatever's going on. But actually, if you're going to be thinking continuously across skills and people and disciplines and other things, we need to be thinking about, well, how can we make spaces that are shaped in different ways? And and that is important. And it is so about the difficulty of it too. I mean, often I think we put time into thinking through the subject and see that that is the difficult thing, but we need to give as much time to nurturing these collaborative relationships too. And that is often the unspoken or perhaps undervalued aspects of this, but this is the work. And I think, you know, this is also what we need to be doing when we're thinking about training ourselves in this space. So this sort of work is the work that we need to do as well.
Yeah, so thinking about industry and the attributes that students might need when they go into industry, this is, you know, working collaboratively is a big one. And how do students work better collaboratively? They have to do it. They have to understand it. They have to understand how to work together to be able to come up with really big solutions for big problems. And so I don't mean to just frame it around industry, but it's kind of creative practice, working together. You're always bouncing ideas off of one another, having some sort of dialogue, and you go out into industry and you do those kinds of things too. With all of these, with the values at the center of the thinking, we could create some big change, I think, is basically what I'm saying. So my next question is, how can localism influence how we use and consume clothing? So you've written and done a lot of research around local wisdom, craft of use, and I'm interested for you to expand upon that a little bit for the audience.
Yeah, it'd be a pleasure. In when I did my PhD, one of the people that I remember reading about localism described working locally as sort of the most powerful mechanism to deliver change towards sustainability. And I suppose I've taken that to heart. The argument is that when you organize things locally, power is distributed in entirely different ways. So if you have influence over decisions that affect your life, you will behave differently. And you can really only do that if you're working on a small enough scale. So that's one of the reasons why it's so powerful. And then the sort of twin reason with that is that where you live, you can see what your environment is like around you, and then you begin to understand in sort of rapid feedback loops the sorts of effects that your actions take. So then you begin to modify. So the idea here is that if you can change the way that people make decisions, and also enable people to see the effects of those decisions and to then begin to adjust what they're doing accordingly, then different and possibly better things will happen, or the idea is that better things will happen. These things aren't always beautiful. They don't always work, we should say, because they're inevitably really diverse. People come with conflicts and other ideas, but what you're saying is that people begin to feel more agency in their own lives. And we would certainly say, if you look at globalization, that's one of the things that's happened, is that benefits are taken almost immediately out of a community and then up to some sort of multinational faceless corporation, you know, offshore in some other location. But if you've got a community, it's a bit like it's like a force that takes it inwards into the community, benefiting what goes on there. So yes, I've done lots of different projects around localism. Some of the work that was on fashion ecologies was involved like mapping the closest town to where I live. So I live in the north of England, and it's this town called Macclesfield. So, I mean, it's in the middle of the country. It's a sort of middle of the road town. It's got a big working class population, but it's surrounded by extreme wealth. It's like near where all the Manchester United footballers live. So it's a sort of like a weird thing. It's really poor and then like this insane wealth around it. And I did all of these mapping techniques, which included things from art practice, things from software, mapping the street with a trundle wheel, like from geography, loitering on the street to watch what people were doing, and then try to build up an understanding from what is actually here about fashion, relationships, and materials locally, and then began to build a different sort of picture about what localism is. And to jump to the end, one of the things that you realize is that it's a bit like a plant that has a root system that you can't really see, and then all of the showy stuff above ground, which are the flowers and the fruits and whatnot. And you realize that most of what people see as fashion, local fashion, is the stuff that you see above ground. So it's the normal stuff that you can trade in. It's like a regional manufacturing hub. It's like traditional materials. But actually, in order for that stuff above ground to exist in the first place, you really need to invest in what's underneath, in the root system that's not so visible. And this is all of the stuff that we do in our homes, in our lives, the skills that we have, the attitudes we have towards resourcefulness and pleasure in material possessions rather than necessarily consumption, in all of that. And that work goes on to have like a beating heart. And actually, one of the new projects that's going to happen with Earth Logic is exploring a local fashion government in the northwest of England. That'll happen this autumn. So yeah, it's a small pilot project to see what that might be when we need to make different sorts of decisions and put checks and balances in place for what fashion might be when we look at it regionally.
How are you going to gather the government together as a group? Is there going to be a voting system?
Well, at the moment, we're going to invite lots of different people from all different parts of the fashion actors and supply chains and local people and local government representatives, and then also space for nature in there. So for linen that we know currently is growing in the northwest of England, along with wool, along with water, because of course that's the thing that's making everything run, and other things too. So this is part of the idea, because one of the things that we discovered within Earth Logic, so governance is one of the Earth Logic landscapes, but it really is the least explored. So we've got lots of understanding of some of the minute parts of supply chains, but this overarching way of thinking about what is fairness, how are we going to distribute things, what are the checks and balances that keep our systems of fashion running, are completely underdeveloped. So this is our first attempt to do that.
It's absolutely fascinating. I'm very interested to see how that develops. I'm thinking back to your book, I guess local wisdom, but I'm wondering how narrative and storytelling influence change within sustainable design.
So I would say it's like one of our most powerful tools, and maybe I've come somewhat late to it. I don't know. So certainly the thing that was behind the Local Wisdom project, which ended up as a book called The Craft of Use, and then the skills and the cultivated practices of usership. The idea behind that was a very sort of simple thing. It was about like a what if question. So what if we paid as much attention to using the things we've already got, to maintaining them, to caring for them, and to wearing them over and again? What if we did that paid as much attention to that as we do to designing and producing things in the first place? And it wasn't in any way trying to say that the design and production isn't important, but it was trying to sort of rebalance things somewhat. And the reason behind it was because designing and producing things is not solely driven by a desire to produce and consume more. It's motivated by different sorts of forces. It's motivated generally by satisfaction and functionality and practicality and just the day-to-day mundane decisions of our lives. So if we give more emphasis to that and just try to see what that is, it gives us a hint of what life might be like if we found some way to confront consumerism as the standard way of engaging with fashion. And so I've somehow forgotten what your question was. Sorry.
Yeah.
That was the
I was talking about storytelling and narrative and how that has influenced your thinking around sustainable design.
Yeah. So that project then, in order to begin to sort of gather field work and data and whatnot, I started asking people to tell me the stories of how they use the things they've already got. And then from that moment, this thing, which is the beginnings of all of these tales, the personal expression that you see, that's something when it's spoken in the words of people's experience and life, completely changes what people feel about it. And even the act of the storytelling on behalf of these people speaking it out to me was such a powerful force for them and also for me. I was definitely changed by it, but the voicing of it, the giving it good attention felt powerful too. And then when these stories were put together in the book, it was very different to all the other work that I had done, because it was a book that was made up at least half of other people's stories about what they do, as evidence that actually these things are already happening. It's not like you need to say, oh, we need to invent something brand new, which is another one of the preferences that industry has, I would say, that we always need to invent something new rather than perhaps going back to existing practices or roots or continuing from where we were before. And the thing is, I totally recognize that what we're doing here is we're expanding the field of practice of fashion beyond the narrow framing of the industry. But it's not like there are no opportunities for industry in that. It's just that they're changed opportunities. And when we're building from the ideas of others, the sorts of things we have to do as designers is just different. And this is perhaps yet again another one of the skill sets that we need to develop, that resisting that urge to go back and make something new of our own imagination. Actually, and there was a great quote that I remember reading where this person was saying, oh yeah, originality in the West means something so different to the way that originality is viewed in a First Nations community. So in the West, originality means something new, never thought of before. You have to come up with an idea that's almost, out of the air. Whereas originality for a First Nations community means going back to origins. So actually, it's not like up to an imaginative space, but actually it's down into the rootedness of everything, effectively back down into the earth. And that, I think, is what that project felt like, and that's where the storytelling emerged. And then since then, I've gone on to use storytelling, including from my own life, which I would never have imagined that I would ever have done before. But now I've gone on to do that. And that feels like, at the moment, a powerful way to show people other narratives other than the standard one.
Mm-hmm. You're talking a little bit about First Nations and going back into the roots to come up with innovation. Narrative and storytelling, it's such a good quote that you've given, because narrative and storytelling is part of how First Nations people identify, communicate. It's very much part of the culture. So thanks for that quote, because it's a really good one. I'm kind of interested to talk a little bit about, you've also touched upon innovation and the way that Western culture thinks about innovation. And I'm interested to hear your opinions on circular economy, regenerative design, and how you see this playing out in industry within fashion system.
So circular economy ideas, I think, have value, but I don't see them as unproblematic. I see them that we need to have a real understanding of them and to begin to direct them to the place in the system that they can work effectively. And I say that for lots of reasons. I suppose I would say that I'm really guarded about circularity as an uncontested goal. I think we really need to begin to think through what the implications are. And the reasons for this are many. So as a principle, as a top line principle, it totally makes sense because of the aspiration to make something a closed system and for things to be recycled and reused in a system. This is materials or resources or energy or whatever it is in perpetuity. That feels like a very attractive prospect. And I similarly am seduced by that as a prospect. But the reality is that it's not the way that it's working, and it seems like it completely goes against the laws of thermodynamics, actually, because it's impossible to create a system which is totally closed in this way. And to think or to pretend that we can do that is, I think, really, really difficult and needs to be discussed. Certainly at the moment, we don't have the technologies, the recycling technologies, to even approximate that as a thing, let alone the thermodynamics question. And then also there's a question of logistics. At the moment, it's sort of pretended that logistics is free, that getting if it's a garment, the garment that's been discarded back to fibre and then back out to is a massive amount of transportation involved with that. And the logistics of this thing just doesn't add up. And so what we see across the board is that circular economy is a higher level recycling strategy, and that should be encouraged. But it's perhaps what you'd call a transition strategy. Okay, in the short term, while we figure out actually where it is that we want to go. And the thing that has made circularity in particular so attractive to businesses is that it aligns very well to existing models, and it allows the growth logic to continue because it allows people to continue consuming perhaps even faster. And so that's one of the reasons why it's been so successful, not because it's an effective environmental solution, as is proven at the moment. And then most of circularity is based on polyester as a fibre, and we all know that there are the microfiber issues, which are the unintended consequences, absolutely, of producing polyester. But these are now small 5 millimeter length fibres that are washing out of all clothes, just as a normal course of using these things. And I know actually in Plymouth, you've got a group of very eminent scientists who work out of Plymouth who are investigating these things. So you have all of these things. And I suppose what the microfiber question seems to do is it seems to say to us, hang on a minute, but that circular economy idea isn't the right one. We don't need to coat the fibers to stop them shedding. Well, actually, we just need a different solution. We need to sort of step back and go back again. And then just, sorry, I know I've been...
No, it's good.
One more thing that I think is really worthwhile raising. And so just a couple of weeks ago, there was a paper, a research paper that was produced in Finland. And it was exploring the climate change costs of different sorts of strategies which are promoted within the circular economy. So these include things like recycling and then a shift to rental models and other things. And anyway, to cut a long story short, this paper revealed that the highest impact associated with climate change costs and these various scenarios was linked to rental models of fashion, and the lowest impact was just wearing the things you've already got for longer. I mean, of course, we sort of
logic, yeah.
we knew that. But I think what it was doing very helpfully, it's beginning, so there's a rising tide of critique where we now really need to think through what the implications of this is, let alone the worker implications of what circular economy means. At the moment, I don't think anyone has thought those things through either. So it's a sort of, it's a mixed picture. And I think for me, perhaps the as well as all the practical things that don't really work, the concern is that because it's being driven by economic value exclusively, with environmental value sort of secondary in this case, it doesn't seem to be perhaps the right way to go. Certainly not the right way to hang all our hopes on.
No, thank you for that. It's really clear, and really clear to me the reasons why you've developed Earth Logic as a way of thinking beyond that, rather than this sort of midway approach that I think maybe circular economy might offer. Your Earth Logic seems to think of it as the bigger picture, and I think bigger change can happen there. So thank you. I have one more question. My last question is, why fashion? How did you get into fashion? And where did all of this come from? Yes.
No, totally. So as you may or may not be able to tell from my accent, I'm from Liverpool. And I grew up in a working class community in the 1980s, in a time when Margaret Thatcher famously had put the city of Liverpool into managed decline. And this was her response to the city being militant, being very politicized, being antsy, and to grow up in a place that was pretty much written off was extraordinarily depressing. And it was only when I left that I realized that this wasn't a common experience for the rest of the UK. Other cities in the north, granted, but other people, they just had sailed through this period. And so I think then, in this time of from a family with few resources and little hope, I was really thrown onto doing things for myself, for thinking, okay, I need to affect change, I need to do things. And one of the things that I could do, and my grandma was a seamstress, I could sew. And so from a very early age, I started experimenting like so many teenagers do. And I made my entire school uniform and was ridiculed endlessly for this. And then, so this was the place that I was able to make practical difference to my life. And then it became the outlet for who I was. Again, like so many people start emerging and developing both creativity and identity forming often through making clothes. And I was one of them. And it was also tied to this real sense of politicization. We felt ignored. I knew that change had to happen. I knew that it had to come from within inside me, because no one was helping. And that's where it emerged. And my parents were just sort of community minded people. And yeah, maybe they sewed it in us then, but I'm not the only one. I've got an older brother who's pretty much cast in the same way as me. So I don't know, in the Fletcher genes, maybe.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful chatting with you and listening through your ideas. It's just so wonderful to have you here. I'm going to open up to questions from the audience, if there are any.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you so much, Kate. That was really interesting talk. It's very, very inspirational. Just wanted to ask a question about originality and thinking of new ideas, which, as we all know, is a huge pressure on young designers and those training to be designers. Do you think there's any future in the notion of co-creation, Kate, with your clients and your audience? It's becoming quite a thing in some other parts of design. User experience design, for instance. I wonder if it has any meaning in fashion.
Well, I hope so, because if we're working with, which is what the prefix co means, working with clients, the more than human world, this is surely the only way that we can de-center humans and our own individual interests. and begin to look beyond our own short-term focus. That seems to me to be essential. Again, I don't think it's easy. I don't think where we cultivate the skills of working together and of respectful listening and making the space for deep listening, and to be able to amend what we're doing on the fly, to adjust it, to allow that thing that we want to say or want to do, to allow that to go. And I think these things are, the work, that's part of this work of change. I think that feels like we need to do that, as well as also understand what the practicalities might be of forming some sort of co-creation project.
Okay, thank you. It's something which I hope we can work on at Plymouth College of Art in coming years. So it's really interesting to hear your view on it. There's
a question from Alice. Do you want to ask your question, Alice?
I just thought this was such an interesting talk, and it really really set off loads of little sparks in my head. There's a thing about fashion I'd noticed, which was that it's so homogenized. You go to any city in the world, everyone's dressed the same. And I think I really noticed it a few years ago. I went traveling and we landed in Mexico City, and everyone was wearing exactly what they'd been wearing when I'd left London. And it really struck me. So I just wanted to ask you about this, the idea of sort of localism in fashion. Do you think that will, in turn, bring back more of a local, look? Because, if you're making things locally, that's your local culture. There's going to be different colours, fabrics, things available that we've really lost, especially in the UK, because, we've got the same high street up and down the country and the same shops. It's really quite boring, actually. And I think probably a long time ago, there was all kinds of different things. My granny's from Lytham, and she always says to me, she's 94, she always says, when I was growing up, you could go to the local farm and there would be a different cheese from every single farm. And I imagine that it would have been the same with fabric and clothing. There would have been a different look in each town and village. And I think we've really lost that. And it's only if you go to quite remote parts of the world that you find that now. And I think that, this idea of localism really, for me, really sort of tied into how brilliant that could be if we could sort of make, bring some of that back, some of that, I suppose, just local culture, I guess, and allow people to explore it a bit more, maybe.
Absolutely. Yeah. Fashion culture is the thing that we need to work on, is absolutely what it is. What you're describing, and this difference within localism, you would say, that things would evolve, become place adapted. So it might be the climate, it might be local preferences, it might be that you've got like a carnival going on, and so something emerges in there. It might be that you've got a particular breed of sheep that are particularly suited to the hillside, and that they have a grey fleece or whatever it is. But so the thing is, what we're seeing here is a set of questions that, because of globalization and the homogenizing force of that, and you're right, Mexico City or whichever, Thailand or wherever, and you go and you land and you find that everyone's wearing jeans with those fake ripped knees, and you're like, when did, it's just so, but it's the globalizing force. And so this is a question of how powerful can we be? How powerful is that? And what are the vested interests in maintaining that? And so these are, very quickly we end up in political questions of political economy and other things, but that shouldn't perhaps stop us. And what increasingly we see is that we need plurality for lots of different reasons, to include people who've not had space, had voice, but also to include lots of other things, including the non-human world. And yeah, I agree. So Macclesfield famously had its own stripe that is unique to Macclesfield. The concern, of course, is that would allow many people to just to try to consume everything. Like within postmodernism, people feel impelled to consume absolutely everything, rather than actually just consuming your regional preference. And you raise a parallel with food and fashion, I think, are very interesting to study alongside each other. And I did write a paper in fashion practice. Sadly, it's behind a paywall, but maybe you guys have a subscription in the library to fashion practice. But it's about comparing food and fashion. And I think, I mean, it's just it's like a thought experiment. It's a playful engagement with what is it? And I think it is really, really useful to look at food and fashion, certainly local food, and think, well, does that help us with local fashion ideas? And it totally does, up to the point at which food and fashion actually diverge in type. And what you realize every time you eat a meal, you know, you consume it all, it goes, and then you need a fresh meal. Exact same. It's very easily aligned with a business model that keeps on producing. Whereas with clothing, every time you wear an item, you know, it doesn't like disappear after that, it stays. So actually it's fundamentally sort of different sorts of questions that arise. And so it helps. So the food system really helps us when we're thinking through regional materials, local manufacturing, but it doesn't help us with questions of volumes and consumption. And so we need to sort of think differently. But you're right, I mean, variety and other stuff, it's brilliant.
Thank you.
Judith is next.
Yes, thank you for a really great talk, Kate. I'm nothing to do with fashion, so I found it really interesting. But I noticed that you kind of mentioned the politics word and then and globalization, and then kind of moved on. And I just wanted to ask you about some of the forces ranged against this, because I thought several times while you were speaking about, I'm a bit older than you, and I was a teenager in Manchester in the early 1970s. And what I and all my peers wanted was to look different from each other. We wanted to make things, and we wanted to make our own things and wear our own things. And we were part of a culture that championed your own, you know, some degree of individuality and difference, and very much making things. And what I find depressing about now is that a lot of the younger girls that I know, they not only want to look exactly the same as each other, but they want the actual same item as each other. So if there's something that is on, you know, my friend's very young daughter, if there's something that's on Boohoo, they want it. They want the actual thing, not just one that looks like it. So I find this change from wanting to be different to wanting to be the same quite depressing, especially as a feminist. And I everything you're saying is right, and it's good. But how do we tackle those really big forces that get at people, especially young people, at such a kind of vicious level, really, and just make them feel afraid of being different?
Yeah, again, this is the real work, isn't it? To work in this way. I think that one of the things that we would say has undermined our commitment to looking different, and also to sticking with the things we've already got. So one of the things that's undermined that is price, specifically low price and availability. And so we're in a situation where low cost of goods has enabled greater access to them. And it's not that that's without other implications. I mean, people frequently put forward and argue that, you know, it's a democratization of fashion and whatnot. But actually, I don't think that stands as an argument, because, of course, democracy means, you know, control over the means of production, not which items you choose. But still, so this is one of the things that's undermining it. And I think and then, I mean, now we get into the sort of real conversation, is that, so 62.5%, I think it is, percent of world textiles that are produced are all in polyester. And they are being funded largely by the oil industry. So polyester is a byproduct of an oil industry that is looking for where it can push its product, perhaps especially when there are other pressures, for example, to shift away from petrol for car use and other things. And so we see that The cost of polyester is also reducing. So in real time, so in the course of like 20 years, the price of clothing reduced by 1/4. And in that same time, people bought, of course, like 1/4 more stuff. I mean, you see the logic of all of this. So there's something around price that is really problematic. There's certainly something around social media that's needs to be thought through or understood or framed differently. And then we look at the evidence that we get, for example, from psychology. So the meta studies that have looked at the relationship between material consumption and well-being show that up to the point at which basic needs are met, so it's important there that you have access to materials when your basic needs are met, but beyond that point, each additional new purchase of a material item doesn't increase well-being substantively, and sometimes actually it undermines it.
Of course.
And then we go on to see that having a materialistic mindset is much more closely aligned to higher levels of antidepressant use, to having fewer friends. And what we see, we're locked into a system that's pushing us towards a way that's actually disconnecting us from the very people we're trying to attach to by buying the stuff. And so we're locked in, I mean, it's like a social trap. And then you say, like, so why is that happening? And it's like based in, well, money making. And again, without trying to be too simplistic, I mean, who knows how to unpick that and to start again? But perhaps we need to instead, rather than perhaps being consumed by that, is we need to think, okay, so what else can we do? How can we commit to different sorts of relationships with clothes? What can we do? And maybe that's where lots of the other good work is going on. And maybe that's where we need to put our energies, like into the stuff. I mean, I'm not just saying with Earth Logic, but all that and all the other work that is going on.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I have to leave for an 11 o'clock meeting, but it's been a fantastic session, and thank you very much.
Welcome.
Okay, I think that there's one more question from Jane Norris.
Hi. Well, my area of interest is with education of garment making, and I'm wondering how much do you feel a revival in home dressmaking could contribute towards, a better future?
Definitely think it can. I think when you've had experience of laying out a pattern, cutting it, stitching it, ripping it open when you've made the mistake, going again, once you've understood how much time is invested, not only, and then also the cost, the fabric maybe, the various notions, whatever it is that you need. Once you've understood that, you begin to realize and engage with what you're wearing in a totally different way. And perhaps it's the same for most things. Once you've understood what it takes to put a meal together, maybe you have a new respect for a chef, and in the same way here. And I think that's definitely part of it, but also because it gives you the skills of problem finding and problem solving, which are, absolutely linked to mending, to repairing our world, to extending care, not just for each other, but also for the broader world and for all of the elements within it. So these are all the associated skills. So I would say, absolutely, it sounds good. And are you working with children? What sort of?
Well, I have taught teenagers, but I've been doing my MA in creative education. I've been teaching adults. And, there's a real kind of nostalgia for, I'd love people really love the idea of being able to make clothes like their grandmothers did. And I think, for me, in the 70s, started dressmaking, it was still around, and that was still at a time where every little village had a draper's shop and sold fabric. But, since then, it's just disappeared, and more so disappeared from education, mainstream education. And, and I'm looking at it now for adults in terms of a personal development as well, because if people are able to express themselves, because your clothes are sort of like your aura, as it were. So I'm kind of thinking, well, that could help us not to all look the same, that people recognise that there's ways of developing certain enhancing certain parts of you.
I think that's all the questions, Kate. I wanted to extend a really warm thank you for joining us today. It's been a really nice discussion, and it's really valuable to hear your insight into all of these topics, really important for our students and for myself. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you all, and have a wonderful summer.